Hello everyone, welcome to this review. This should be a lot of fun, and we're really just going to jump right into it. That way you can get as much questions and answers and reviewing going as possible. This will be similar to the format that we used last time, and hopefully it will all work out. So let's dive into it. I have a new idea regarding scoring to make things a little simpler, but we'll see. See if that really works or not. So let's get into the thick of it, shall we? So slightly differently, I actually was smart enough to put letters this time to designate the different answers, but I wanted to share something new this time through, and that was the way we'll score things. Now you'll notice for each question you have, and we'll get through hopefully 30 questions or so, that you have obviously A, B, C, and D. So here's what I'll suggest you do. When you first see the question, which is in the middle, and you see the four answers, make a guess by, maybe putting maybe a little circle or something inside the box. So if you think the first president of the United States was Benjamin Franklin, you could put a C here. But then I take away Franklin as an option, and then you're like, okay, well, it's definitely not Franklin, so maybe it's Adams, and so you go for B. Then I remove Adams as well, and then you're like, well, maybe it's Jefferson, so you once more put an X through it and decide to go for Jefferson, and then I put a line through it, and then you realize, okay, well, it's Washington, sorry. And so Washington is the correct answer. So here's what I'll say you do. For each time you get it right, each circle you get, a circle is worth, let's say, 5 points. This will keep it nice and happy. On the flip side, though, each X is worth -1 points. Point. That way, you can see how many times you've had to change your answer. The amount of X's you incur up here will adversely affect your score. Now, once more, the score thing is just to keep it fun and interesting. The main thing is to help you review for your test, review for the game. Oh, goodness. So, on that note, let us begin. And if the scoring thing doesn't make any sense, we'll manage, we'll deal. We'll start this question in England, of all places. Who was the executed Archbishop of Canterbury? This has something to do with Henry VIII, but who was the executed Archbishop of Canterbury, the one bishop who did not want to go along with Henry VIII's claims to be the head of the Church of England or agree to his marrying Anne? Was it A, Thomas More, B, John Fisher, C, John Knox, or D, Henry Becket? Let's get rid of a few options up front. It was not John Knox. John Knox was the founder of Presbyterianism, mainly in Scotland, so right island, wrong location. It was not Henry Becket. There is no such person as Henry Becket. Thomas Becket was an Archbishop of Canterbury who was executed by King Henry II, but Henry Becket is not real. Thomas Becket is. Thomas More is real, but he was not the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was Lord Chancellor. The correct answer is B, John Fisher, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was executed under orders from Henry VIII for refusing to take the oaths that were tied up with the Act of Succession and Supremacy. Here we go, question 2. Just play along whatever way works best for you. I just mentioned this by accident. I forgot that this was the next question, but we'll see how well you do. Who started Presbyterianism in Scotland? Was it Thomas More, A, Thomas More, B, John Calvin, C, John Knox, or D, Ulrich Zwingli? Who started Presbyterianism in Scotland? Was it Thomas More, John Calvin, John Knox, or D, Ulrich Zwingli? Now, Thomas More was Lord Chancellor and is actually a saint, so it's not him. Ulrich Zwingli did a lot of stuff in Zurich, but not in Scotland. And while Presbyterianism has a lot of roots in Calvinism, Calvin himself did not actually start it. That honor would go to John Knox. The answer to who started Presbyterianism in Scotland would be C. John Knox. Question 3. Who was the Pope at the time of essentially the rise of Luther, around 1517 and forward? Who was the Pope who was on duty, if you will, at that point in history, and who sort of did not deal well with the situation at hand? Was it A. Leo X, B. Gregory XI, C. Alexander VI, or D. Julius II? And you'll be seeing a lot of Gregories as we go forward because there's two very famous ones. Let's find out if it's at this time, though. Well, strangely, it's not Gregory XI. Let me just get him out of the way right now. Gregory XI will become more famous a little bit later. I'm not going to quite reveal it. Alexander VI, while not a great pope, was not the one on the job when Luther showed up. And while Julius II was right before him, Julius II was dead by the time by the time Luther rolls around. So the answer to this is Leo X, who was Pope, especially Pope at the time of 1517 and the events thereafter. Question 4. Who started a theocracy in Geneva and preached a heretical version of predestination? Remember, predestination itself isn't wrong, but it can be taken in an improper way. Who started a theocracy in Geneva and preached a heretical version of predestination? Was it A. John Calvin, B. Ulrich Zwingli, C. Martin Luther, or D. Charles V? Well, it was not Zwingli. Zwingli was very much in Zurich. And it was not Charles V. While Charles V did hold power, he held it over the whole Holy Roman Empire. And while Martin Luther wanted to have his church succeed politically, he would never go to a full-fledged theocracy. That honor was strictly due to John Calvin. The answer to number 4 is A, John Calvin. Starts a theocracy in Geneva, Switzerland, and preaches a heretical view of predestination. Question 5. Of the two proto-Protestants, which one was not? Of the two proto-Protestants, which one was executed? Of the two proto-Protestants, which one was executed? Was it A. Niccolo Machiavelli, B. Jan Hus, C. Jerome Savonarola, or D. John Wycliffe? Of the two proto-Protestants, and both of the proto-Protestants are on here, which of them was not executed? Well, Machiavelli was many things, but he was neither a proto-Protestant, nor was he executed, at least for this part. So A. Machiavelli. Not him. And while Savonarola was executed, he was not really considered a proto-Protestant. He was just not listening to the Pope. Jan Hus and John Wycliffe are both proto-Protestants, but only one of them was executed. John Wycliffe died of old age. Jan Hus was the one who was burned at the stake, despite having a safe conduct pass that would guarantee him safety. So the answer to 5 is B. Jan Hus is the one who was executed of the two. And this is the other one, by the way. Question number 6. Which pope abdicated the papacy, left the throne, in order to bring an end to the Western Schism? Was it A. Gregory XI, B. Martin V, C. Benedict XIII, or D. Gregory XII? Which pope abdicated to end the Western Schism, to bring a swift end to the whole thing? Now this was, to refresh your memory, this was the arrangement that the Pope said he would leave the papacy. This is the Pope in Rome. He would leave the papacy so that everyone could get together, both in France and Italy, to all get together and elect the right Pope. Now, the Pope that they ultimately chose to elect was Martin V. He is the next Pope, but who is the Pope before him, more correctly? Gregory XI was actually the Pope who left France originally and ended the Babylonian captivity, so it's not him. Benedict XIII at this point was actually an anti-pope and was one of the people causing problems, so it's not him either. The Pope who actually left the throne was Gregory XII. He was the one who made the very dangerous offer to be recognized as the real Pope and then to leave the papacy. Question number 7. When, we know it's October 31st, but in what year did Martin Luther nail his 95 Theses to the University chapel door in Wittenberg? Was it 1505, A, 1505, B, 1507, C, 1517, or D, 1521? Which year did he do it? Well, 1505 is when he was nearly struck by lightning, but it wasn't this year. So, sorry, not 1505. 1521 was the Diet of Worms, where he was brought forward in front of the Holy Roman Emperor, but he had already posted his 95 Theses there as well. In 1507, he had become a priest, but it was 10 years later that he actually got around to posting those 95 Theses, predominantly on indulgences, papal authority, purgatory, and a handful of other issues like that. The correct answer is 1517 for the 95 Theses. Which pope, with his numerous problems, is famously known as the Borgia Pope? Borgia is a name synonymous with underhanded dealings, affairs, scandalous actions, all sorts of things like this. Which of these is known as the Borgia Pope? Is it A, Julius II, B, Gregory XI, C, Alexander VI, or D, Leo X? While Gregory XI actually dealt with getting the papacy out of France, so it's not quite him. Nor is it Leo X, who was a Medici Pope, who was not much better, but still at the same time better than this Borgia Pope. Nor is it Julius II, the warrior Pope. The Borgia Pope was Alexander VI, who was quite a notoriously scandalous man, with many affairs, with 2 very famous and infamous children, who also welcomed the Jews after Isabel kicked them out of Spain. Interesting guy. And probably one of the most famous naughty popes, if you will. Which Renaissance artist is famous for his statue work of the David, multiple Pietas, and the Sistine Chapel ceiling? Which Renaissance artist is famous for all these? Is it A, Michelangelo, B, Raphael, C, Donatello, or D, Leonardo? Why lie? This was just an excuse for me to list the Ninja Turtles on a quiz. So, here they are. Well, let's get rid of them. Donatello is the one who sticks out the most because he actually lived before all the others, so it's actually not C, Donatello. Raphael painted a lot, but he didn't sculpt that much, so it's not him. And while Leonardo da Vinci did a ton, he's remembered more so for his inventions and anatomy than his artwork. The correct answer of the amazing Renaissance artist, the true visionary, is Michelangelo. The best. Question 10. I think this is a bit of a trick question, but we'll have fun with it. Who was the second husband of Catherine of Aragon? It's a very interesting way of looking at it, but it might help you remember a part of the story. Who was the second husband of Catherine of Aragon? It's a matter of trying to place who Catherine of Aragon was. Well, let's get rid of some people who it wasn't. Arthur II is kind of a clue to who. Well, we'll get rid of Arthur in a second. But anyway, it's not Ferdinand the First. He was married to Isabel. Charles V, it's not him either. I don't even remember who his wife is, but not too important. It's not Arthur either, although Arthur is a bit of a clue to this name and to the answer here. The answer is that it's Henry. Now, for Henry, this was his first wife, but for his wife, Catherine, this was not her first marriage. She was originally married to Arthur, just Arthur I, or whatever you want to call him. But Arthur was the one who died, and then Henry VIII married his dead brother's sister. That is who Catherine of Aragon's second husband was Henry VIII. Just a neat way of looking at it. I know it's a bit backwards. Question 11. Who was the last Roman emperor? This was the guy who lost the city of Constantinople, but who was he? Was it Constantine the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, or the 2000th? Constantine the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, or the 2000th? Well, Constantine 12, sorry, not him. Constantine 13, well, it sounds great, not him. And despite all of your wanting it to be the case, it is not Constantine 2000, but Constantine the 11th. Which is why it's on question number 11. Bit of a hint there. If you got it, great. If not, trust me, it was pure coincidence. Question 12. Who was the last canonized pope until we reached the 20th century? Who was the last canonized pope until we reached the 20th century? Was it Paul III, Pius V, Alexander VI, or Leo X? Last canonized one. Well, we've talked about Alexander VI being the Borgia Pope. It's not him. And Leo X was the guy who was in charge while Martin Luther was around, and he didn't do a good job. It wasn't him. Paul III was a very nice man, but there's a very famous holy one after him with Pius V. Pius V was a very holy and simple pope, yet at the same time he enforced a lot of the issues of the Council of Trent. Question 13. When was the fall of Constantinople? When did Constantine XI finally lose his city? Was it in 1453, 1489, 1492, or 1505? When did Constantinople finally fall? 1453, 1489, 1492, or 1505? Well, it was not 1492, which is famous for two major reasons. Nor was it Luther's lightning bolt year, which is kind of one of the key events of 1505. Wasn't that one. Nor was it 1489. Constantinople finally fell almost exactly 1,000 years, well, 1,000 years plus 43, 1,000 years after Rome originally fell. 1453. Question 14. Who was the founder of the Jesuits? Who was the founder of the Jesuits? Was it Francis Xavier, John Tetzel, Ignatius of Loyola, or Teresa of Avila? Which one of these four people is the founder of the Jesuits? Francis Xavier, John Tetzel, Ignatius of Loyola, or Teresa of Avila? Now, some of you may recall that the Jesuits are a male order, therefore it's not Teresa. Some of you may also recall that John Tetzel was the guy who sort of got the flame going of Luther's being upset over indulgences. John Tetzel was a Dominican, and he did not start any orders, so it's not him either. And while both of these men, A and C, Francis Xavier and Ignatius of Loyola, are Jesuits, only one of them started the order. It was not Francis Xavier, it was Ignatius of Loyola. C is the correct answer. In question 15, another proto-Protestant question. I told you there were two of them, but let's see how well you remember. Which proto-Protestant was an Oxford professor? Which proto-Protestant was an Oxford professor? Was it A. Martin Luther, B. John Wycliffe, C. Savonarola, or D. John Calvin? Well, it was not John Calvin. John Calvin showed up much later. He was not a proto-Protestant nor a professor. Savonarola was not a proto-Protestant. He's not one of the two proto-Protestants. Nor was he an Oxford professor. And while the remaining two men both were Oxford professors, they were in different places, and one of them came first. Martin Luther was in Wittenberg, not in Oxford. John Wycliffe, though, was one of the first people to expound some of the most basic tenets of Protestant faiths, including denial of a lot of the sacraments, and the Church and the Pope's authority, and advocating for sola scriptura in a special way. Question number 16. Which of these does Joan of Arc not do? Which of these does Joan of Arc not do? Does she win battles? A. Win battles. B. Get the English king crowned. C. Lose battles. And D. Hear voices. Which one of these four things does she not do? Which means she does the other three. Well, that she heard voices seems likely. Joan of Arc's success cannot just be attributed to her personality. This is unprecedented in human history. And Joan of Arc did lose battles. She was not always successful. Paris was probably the key battle that she lost. Nor okay, how do I phrase this again? She does lose battles, and she also wins battles. She actually, most of her early battles are all victories, very quick victories as well. Sorry about that. Quick little snafu. I recognize I made a mistake with question 16, so we're just going to count it as a free one because I didn't actually leave an answer for which of these she does not do. I completely forgot to actually provide an answer for that. I just marked a bunch of things that she did. She does win her battles, and so my apologies on that. I was sitting here looking at this a little confused. She does win battles. She loses a couple towards the end. She does get the English king crowned. And she does hear her voices. That all of these add up. So, my apologies about that. I was a little confused as I was doing it as well, and I apologize for any confusion I brought to you. Onwards. Question 17. Who calls the Council of Trent? Who calls for the Council of Trent? Was it Pope Paul III, Pope Pius V, Pope Innocent III, or Pope Clement V? A lot of 3s and 5s here. Which one of these guys, though, calls for the Council of Trent? Well, Pope Innocent III is back in the medieval era, so it's not him. And he does a lot of reforms, but they're way back when. Pope Clement V is the guy who starts the Babylonian captivity of the church, but it's not him. And while Pius V is incredibly holy, in fact is a canonized saint in comparison with the other guy, he did not actually start the Council of Trent. That would actually go to Pope Paul III, who begins and convenes the first session of the Council of Trent. Question 18, looking for a number. When was the Reconquista of Spain? When was Spain finally back entirely under Catholic authority, the Reconquest. Starting in 711, when did it end? Was it 1453, 1456, 1492, or 1521? When did this occur? Well, 1453, as you may recall, was when the Ottoman Turks successfully captured Constantinople. It was a little bit later, though, that Spain reconquered, Catholic Spain reconquered itself. 1521 was the Diet of Worms, so it's not that one. That was Martin Luther's famous defiant, "Here I stand, I cannot do other." 1456 is considered the invention of the printing press. The Reconquista occurred in the same year that Columbus discovered America, 1492. In fact, it was because the Reconquista was over that year that Columbus was able to take his voyage. Which Dominican monk was executed for his disobedience to the Pope? Was it Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, Jan Hus, or Jerome Savonarola? Which one of these four was a Dominican monk who was ultimately executed for his disobedience to the Pope? Well, you may recall that Martin Luther was never executed. He had very powerful friends to protect him. And Thomas Aquinas, while he was Dominican, is a saint and not executed. Both of the bottom two men were ultimately executed, but only one of them was a Dominican monk, and that was Jerome Savonarola. Jan Hus was a priest, but he wasn't exactly, and he was executed for a number of reasons, including heretical views, but Savonarola was most famously targeted because he did not respond to the Pope's plea to come to Rome. Question 20. Another which of these not questions, and I think I did this one correctly. Or did I mess this one up too? Making sure. Nope. Messed this one up too. I was so adamant about putting correct answers that I forgot to put some incorrect answers for these. I need to double check this. But anyway, which of these does Luther not preach? We're not going to waste our time with question 20 as much, because he actually preaches all of these. Luther preaches that after the fall, man was totally depraved. That's man's total wickedness. He does believe that Mary remained a virgin throughout her life, and that the Bible alone, sola scriptura, is all we need, and that our good works were of no merit, and that it was our faith alone, or sola fide, that saved us. And so he actually advocates for all of these positions. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to waste a question, but I'm sure you'll forgive me. Question 21. We've mentioned Michelangelo, now let's kind of get to the guy who hired him. Who was the famous warrior pope who hired Michelangelo for the Sistine Chapel? Was it Julius II, David II, Moses, or Alexander VI? Which of these guys, or popes, was famously known as the warrior pope for all of his going off and fighting in battles, and who hired Michelangelo? Well, as far as I can tell, there has not been a Pope Moses, though Michelangelo did carve a Moses sculpture for this pope, for his tomb. Nor was it David II. Michelangelo did create a David, but there is no Pope David II. And nor is it Alexander VI, who is by all accounts a fairly peaceful man. It was Pope Julius II, who had an incredible temper and also an incredible love of warfare, who hired Michelangelo to paint the chapel that originally his uncle, Julius's uncle, had built, Pope Sixtus. Who was the Archbishop of Bordeaux who pretty much caused a major problem, who moved the papacy to Avignon? Was it Francis de Sales, Martin V, Clement V, or Gregory XI? Which one of these guys actually moves the papacy to Avignon? who sort of starts the whole ball rolling of the Babylonian captivity. Well, Francis de Sales hasn't even entered our story yet, so it's not him. Martin V is the guy who, when there's multiple popes, they agree it should be him, so it's not him. And Gregory XI is the guy who moves it back to Rome, but the guy who moved it there in the first place was Clement V. So Clement V moves it to Avignon, and then Gregory XI takes it back out of Avignon back into Rome. This little rhyme or little ditty should be familiar. Divorced, something, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Now, I know it goes in that second blank in terms of an action or how that woman died, but my question to you is, which woman was it? Was it Jane Seymour, Mary Tudor, Anne of Cleves, or Anne Boleyn? Which person goes in that second blank? Now, while Mary Tudor is quite famous and is Bloody Mary and all that, that is Henry VIII's daughter, not one of his 6 wives. And these 5 things here with the blank are Henry VIII's 6 wives. It was not Jane Seymour, that was his 3rd wife. And nor was it Anne of Cleves, that was his 4th wife, who he simply divorced. But it was actually Anne Boleyn, who Henry VIII actually does order to be beheaded, just like Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard being his 5th wife. So, that's what goes in the blank. Question 24. Which Queen of Spain was responsible for, among other things, Christopher Columbus, the Reconquista, the Spanish Inquisition, and also the expulsion of Jews from Spain? Which queen was responsible for all that? Was it A. Elizabeth, B. Mary, C. Isabel, or D. Catherine? Which queen was responsible for all this? Well, it's not Mary. If you are thinking of a Mary right now, it's probably Queen Mary, or Mary Tudor, or Bloody Mary, or Mary of Henry VIII, but it's not Queen of Spain. It's not Elizabeth either. Both of these are in the wrong country. Now, Catherine is, if you will, from the right country, but it's actually her mom who has all of this going on, her mom being Isabel. Queen Isabel or Isabella of Spain. Who was the nun who convinced Pope Gregory XI to return the papacy back into Rome after it had been in France for the better part of a century? Who, out of the blue, shows up and gets the Pope to leave Avignon and return to the very impoverished Rome? Now, we've talked about Joan of Arc, and you realize this is not the right country for her. She convinces people of things, but not quite involving this. Queen Isabel is a queen, not a nun. So it's not her. Teresa of Avila was a great Spanish saint and mystic and prayer-filled woman who did a lot of good in reforming orders, but was not involved in politics in this way. That would actually be Catherine of Siena, who is the nun who got Gregory XI to leave Avignon. Let's finish up these last few, make sure we have enough time to finish all these. What was the philosophy of the Renaissance, sort of philosophy that pervaded all of the Renaissance? Was it A, realism, B, paganism, C, humanism, or D, secularism? Which one of these 4 was the really guiding post of all the Renaissance? Well, it's definitely not A. Realism, you could talk about in art and things like this, and while the Renaissance does have art, that's not what it's all about. Even though some of the art does become quite realistic. The Renaissance was not just outright paganism either. It was definitely an interest in pagan sources, but it wasn't pure paganism. Nor was it secularism. While the world becomes increasingly more secular, it's not the only force that was going on within the Renaissance. That would actually be humanism, that very strong focus on the human person, which could become secular, which could become pagan, but that's what the major philosophy and worldview was of the Renaissance, this humanistic approach to everything, art, government, all of it. Which Holy Roman Emperor tried to deal with the Luther situation? Was it Charles I, Pepin, Sigismund, or Charles V? Which one of these four actually was the Holy Roman Emperor who was convening diet after diet to try to do something about the whole Martin Luther situation? Well, it's not Pepin, or Pepin the Short. That's an older name. Nor is it the first Charles, Charles Magnus, or Charles the Great, Charlemagne. And while Sigismund does try to be a good Holy Roman Emperor, it's actually Charles V who is the one who convenes the Diet of Worms in 1521 to try to have Luther have some sort of account of himself and his actions. Next question, sorry about that blip there. Which one of these is not, I think I did this one right. Which one of these is not one of Henry VIII's children who later on becomes either a king or queen of England? Which one of these is not one of Henry VIII's children who later on becomes a ruler of England? Is it A, William, B, Mary, C, Edward, or D, Elizabeth? I'll just do this in the order that they become king or queen. Edward becomes king first, when he's a boy still, Edward VI. And that's followed by Mary, who is queen afterwards, Bloody Mary, Mary Tudor, who is then followed by Elizabeth, who reigns for a good, healthy 45 years. But William itself, Henry VIII does have an illegitimate son named William, and William is a name that does show up again in British royalty, but he's the one who is not one of Henry VIII's children, at least legitimate ones, who becomes king. Question 29. Speaking of her, it's kind of a fun way of phrasing the matter. Who was the mother of Bloody Mary? Who is the bartender who came up with, I'm kidding, but who is the mother of Bloody Mary? Was it A, Isabel, B, Elizabeth, C, Mary, or D, Catherine? Well, it wasn't Elizabeth, who had no children of her own. Nor was it Isabel, although Isabel is related to Bloody Mary. Nor was it a series of Marys in this case either, although that could happen, it was not the case going on. So the answer is Catherine. Catherine of Aragon is the mother of Bloody Mary. Final one. Which friend of Henry VIII was executed for refusing to swear the oaths that were tied up with the Acts of Supremacy and the Acts of Succession? Was it A, Thomas Becket, B, Thomas More, C, Thomas Fisher, or D, Thomas à Kempis? Which one is it? Well, it's not Thomas Becket. Whoops. Get back into that. Sorry about that. A little behind the scenes footage there. It is not Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket was executed by Henry II, not Henry VIII. It's not Thomas Fisher, which is a spin-off of John Fisher. John Fisher did cause problems for Henry VIII, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Thomas à Kempis was a very good, holy, saintly man, but he was not involved in politics in the way that Thomas More was. So the answer is B, Thomas More. I hope that went well. I hope that worked out well for you. I hope you do well on the test and that this was in some way informative. If you have any questions, let me pause this right here and let me, well, I'm not sure if I could post the answers here in this case or not. So, ask your sub or me any questions you may have involving this video, and I hope you have a nice day. Bye.